What if everything you thought you knew about royal protocol was a carefully orchestrated lie? What if behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, a secret network of loyal guards risked their careers, their freedom, and their lives to protect a princess who had become a prisoner in her own home? On a cold November night in 2023, when the world slept peacefully, believing in the fairy tale of royal life, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, found herself trapped in a web of palace politics so dangerous that her only escape required the help of those sworn to protect the crown itself.
This is not the story the tabloids told.
This is not the narrative the palace wanted you to hear. This is the true account of how the royal guard became rebels, how protocol became betrayal, and how a princess discovered that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is disobedience. The truth behind the palace walls is darker than any scandal the press could imagine, and more inspiring than any fairy tale ever written. What you're about to read will forever change how you see the golden carriages, the waving hands, and the perfect smiles that grace your television screens. Because sometimes the real heroes don't wear crowns, they wear the uniforms of those brave enough to do what's right, even when it means defying everything they've sworn to uphold. Are you ready to discover what really happened behind closed doors? Are you prepared to learn why 4 of Britain's most decorated guards chose conscience over duty, truth over tradition? The story begins not with a princess in distress, but with a guard who noticed something everyone else missed, and decided that silence was no longer an option. The morning shift change at Buckingham Palace happened like clockwork every day at 6 sharp. Sergeant James Morrison had performed this ritual for 8 years, watching the same faces, following the same routes, protecting the same family. But on November 15, 2023, something was different. Something that would shatter his faith in everything he had sworn to protect. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, her silhouette barely visible through the heavy curtains. Morrison had noticed her there for the past 3 weeks, always at the same time, always in the same position. What troubled him wasn't her presence, but her stillness. She stood like a statue, unmoving for hours, staring out at the world beyond the palace gates with an expression he had never seen before. Not sadness, not anger, but something far more disturbing. Defeat. The princess who had once brought light into every room she entered, who had charmed world leaders and comforted grieving families, now moved through the palace corridors like a ghost of herself. Morrison had served under 3 different monarchs, had protected prime ministers and presidents, but he had never seen anyone look so completely trapped within walls meant to shelter them. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during the Tuesday briefing. Colonel Richardson, the head of palace security, announced new protocols specifically for the Princess of Wales. Her movements would be more restricted, her public appearances would be limited to essential royal duties only, and all her private communications would be monitored for security purposes. The reasoning given was increased terrorist threats, but Morrison had read those same intelligence reports. There were no credible threats against Catherine specifically. What made Morrison's blood run cold was the way Richardson delivered these orders. There was something personal in his tone, something that suggested these restrictions came not from concern for the princess's safety, but from someone who wanted her contained. When Corporal Davies asked about the duration of these new measures, Richardson's response was chilling. Until further notice. The princess will comply with all security recommendations without question. That evening, Morrison found himself assigned to corridor duty outside the royal apartments, a position that gave him an unusual view into the private lives of the family he protected. What he witnessed that night would haunt him for months to come. Through a partially open door, he could see Catherine sitting at her desk, her phone in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She was trying to make a call, but each attempt ended the same way. The phone would ring once, then go dead. Morrison realized with growing horror that the princess's communications weren't being monitored for security, they were being blocked entirely. She was being systematically cut off from the outside world, isolated within the very walls where she should have felt most safe. The golden cage that the press often joked about had become all too real. The situation escalated dramatically the following week. Morrison was on night duty when he heard raised voices coming from the private dining room. The Prince of Wales was speaking to someone on the phone, his voice carrying a frustration Morrison had never heard before. "You cannot keep her prisoner here," William was saying. "This is not protection, this is imprisonment, and I won't stand for it." The response came from someone else in the room, though Morrison couldn't identify the voice. "Your Royal Highness, the decision has been made at the highest levels. The princess poses a security risk with her current decorate, emotional state, These measures are temporary but necessary. Morrison's training told him to move away, to respect the privacy of the royal family. But his conscience told him something far more dangerous was happening. When he heard Catherine's voice, small and broken, saying, "Please, I just want to see my children properly. I just want one day where I don't feel like I'm suffocating." Morrison knew he couldn't remain a passive observer any longer. The breaking point came 3 days later during what should have been a routine security sweep. Morrison discovered that Catherine's quarters had been fitted with additional surveillance equipment, cameras and listening devices that weren't part of the standard security protocol. When he questioned Corporal Davies about it, his fellow guard looked uncomfortable. "Orders came from the top," Davies said. "We're to monitor all her activities, document all her conversations, report anything unusual." Morrison felt sick. The woman they were sworn to protect was being treated like a prisoner, watched and monitored every moment of her life. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Royal Guard hadn't just failed in their duty to protect Catherine, they had become the very threat she needed protection from. That night, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't stand by and watch the princess deteriorate under this psychological siege. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, and sometimes protection meant protecting them from the very institution they represented. The next morning, Morrison approached 3 guards he trusted completely: Corporal Davies, Sergeant Williams, and Lance Corporal Thompson. These were men he had served with for years, men whose character he knew beyond question. In a quiet corner of the guards' mess, Morrison laid out everything he had observed: the illegal surveillance, the communication blocks, the gradual isolation of the princess. Davies was the first to speak. "I've been wondering about those new protocols myself. Something felt wrong about them." Williams nodded grimly. "I've seen how she looks now compared to 6 months ago. That's not someone who's being protected. That's someone who's being broken down systematically." Thompson, the youngest of the group, asked the question they were all thinking. "What exactly are you proposing we do about it?" Morrison's answer would set in motion a chain of events that would rock the very foundations of the monarchy. "We're going to do our job," he said simply. "We're going to protect the princess, even if that means protecting her from our own commanders." The plan they developed was dangerous, potentially treasonous, and absolutely necessary. They would create opportunities for Catherine to communicate with the outside world. They would provide her with support and allies within the palace walls, and if necessary, they would help her escape from the golden prison that Buckingham Palace had become. As Morrison lay in his narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his quarters, he thought about the oath he had taken 8 years earlier: to serve and protect the royal family with loyalty, integrity, and courage. He had never imagined that fulfilling that oath would require him to defy direct orders from his superiors. He had never thought that serving the crown would mean betraying the institution that bore its name. But as he thought about Catherine's haunted eyes and broken voice, Morrison knew he was making the right choice. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty was rebellion. Sometimes protecting someone meant becoming their accomplice and escape. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, 4 guards would start a mission more dangerous than any they had ever undertaken. Not to protect the palace from outside threats, but to protect a princess from the palace itself. The Royal Guard was about to become something they had never been before. Revolutionaries in uniform, rebels with badges, protectors who would break every rule to save the person they had sworn to serve. The morning shift change would happen at 6 sharp, just like always. But nothing would ever be the same again. The conspiracy began with something as simple as a cup of tea. On a grey Tuesday morning, Sergeant Williams approached Catherine during her solitary breakfast in the blue drawing room. Protocol dictated that guards should remain invisible, speaking only when spoken to. But Williams broke that rule with deliberate casualness. "Your Royal Highness," he said, placing a fresh cup of Earl Grey beside her untouched plate. "I noticed you prefer it without sugar." "My grandmother always said, tea tastes better when someone remembers how you like it." Catherine looked up, startled. For weeks she had been surrounded by staff who followed orders mechanically, treating her more like a security risk than a human being. This small gesture of personal attention brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. And William saw something flicker in her expression. Hope, perhaps. Or just gratitude that someone still saw her as a person worth caring about. That simple exchange established the foundation for what would become the most audacious rescue operation in modern royal history. Williams reported back to Morrison that evening. "She's desperate for human connection. They've isolated her so completely that a kind word nearly broke her down entirely." The 4 guards met secretly in the old wine cellar beneath the palace. a forgotten storage area that wasn't covered by the new surveillance systems. Morrison had discovered this blind spot during his careful study of the palace's security weaknesses. Weaknesses they would now exploit not to breach security, but to restore a princess's freedom. Davies spread out architectural plans he had quietly obtained from the palace maintenance office. The surveillance is concentrated in her living quarters in the main corridors, he explained. But there are service passages that haven't been updated with cameras. Kitchen staff and cleaning crews use them daily without being monitored. Thompson, despite his youth, had proven invaluable in understanding the palace's communication systems. They blocked her personal phone and monitored her internet access, but they haven't considered older methods. The palace still has internal phone lines that bypass the main switchboard. If we can get her access to one of those, she could make unmonitored calls. Williams had been observing Catherine's daily routine with new eyes, looking for patterns and opportunities. She has a standing appointment with her personal secretary every Thursday at 2, but lately that secretary has been replaced by someone from Colonel Richardson's staff. They're not just monitoring her communications. They're controlling who she can speak with entirely. Morrison listened to his colleagues' reports with growing anger and determination. The picture they painted was of systematic psychological warfare being waged against a woman whose only crime appeared to be independent thinking. What we're dealing with isn't just overprotective security, he told them. This is deliberate persecution disguised as protection. The first phase of their operation began the next day. Williams established himself as Catherine's regular tea server, creating brief opportunities for human connection during her increasingly solitary meals. Davies volunteered for extra corridor duty, positioning himself where Catherine could see a friendly face during her restricted movements around the palace. Thompson took on additional maintenance duties that brought him into contact with Catherine's staff, allowing him to assess who could be trusted and who was reporting her every action to their superiors. Morrison, meanwhile, began his own careful investigation into who was behind Catherine's imprisonment. The orders had come through Colonel Richardson, but Morrison suspected the colonel was following commands from someone with far more authority. His discreet inquiries led him to a disturbing conclusion. The restrictions on Catherine weren't just about security, or even palace politics. They were personal. The breakthrough came during the second week of their operation. Catherine had been scheduled for a public appearance at a children's hospital, but the engagement was cancelled at the last minute, officially due to security concerns. Morrison happened to be present when Richardson received the cancellation order, and he heard something that made his blood boil. Richardson was speaking to someone on his encrypted phone, his voice carrying satisfaction rather than concern. Yes, the engagement has been cancelled. The princess is becoming more compliant with each restriction. A few more weeks of this treatment, and she'll be grateful for any freedom we choose to grant her. Morrison realized with horrifying clarity that Catherine's isolation wasn't temporary security measures, it was psychological conditioning. Someone wanted to break her spirit entirely, to transform the confident, independent woman she had become into someone who would never again challenge palace authority or express opinions that conflicted with official positions. That evening, Morrison shared his discovery with his 3 allies. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. They had to accelerate their timeline. Catherine wasn't just being held prisoner, she was being systematically destroyed, and they might be her only hope for escape. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. They would create a window of opportunity during the weekly security briefing when Richardson and his most trusted staff would be occupied for exactly 90 minutes. During that window, they would escort Catherine out of the palace using service corridors and maintenance exits that bypassed all surveillance systems. But first, they needed to know if Catherine would cooperate with their plan. Morrison took the enormous risk of approaching her directly during her afternoon walk in the palace gardens, one of the few activities she was still permitted, and only under heavy guard supervision. Morrison positioned himself along her usual route and, when Catherine passed close enough, he spoke quietly without looking directly at her. "Your Royal Highness, there are people who want to help you. People who believe you deserve better than this treatment. If you're interested in having options, touch your left earring when you sit down on the garden bench." Catherine's step faltered slightly, but she continued walking without acknowledging his words. Morrison's heart pounded as he watched her reach the bench where she always rested during these supervised walks. She sat down slowly, lifted her hand to her hair, and deliberately touched her left earring. The signal was clear, but Morrison needed to be certain she understood what she was agreeing to. Over the next few days, he and his team established a complex but effective communication system.
When they're...
Williams would include small notes with Catherine's tea service, written on paper that dissolved in water and could be consumed if discovery seemed imminent. Davies would use hand signals during his corridor duties to confirm receipt of messages. Thompson created a system of maintenance schedules that indicated safe times and locations for more detailed communication. Through these channels, they learned the full extent of Catherine's desperation. Her messages, written in careful code, revealed that she hadn't spoken to her closest friends in over a month, hadn't had unsupervised contact with her children in weeks, and was beginning to suffer physical symptoms from the stress of her confinement. She described feeling like she was disappearing a little more each day, and expressed fear that she was losing herself completely. But Catherine also revealed something that surprised and inspired her protectors. Despite months of psychological pressure, despite being cut off from her support systems and treated like a security threat, she hadn't broken. Her spirit was bruised but not destroyed, and she was ready to fight for her freedom. The final message she sent through their secret communication system contained just 8 words, but they carried the weight of absolute determination. I trust you. Tell me when and how. Morrison looked at his 3 companions in their hidden cellar meeting room. Davies, steady and reliable, had never failed to complete a mission. Williams, with his gentle manner hiding steel determination, had already proven his commitment by risking his career daily to provide Catherine with basic human kindness. Thompson, young but brilliant, had shown tactical thinking that impressed even Morrison. Gentlemen, Morrison said, his voice carrying the gravity of what they were about to attempt, we are about to commit what many will consider treason. We are about to defy direct orders, break our oaths of service, and potentially destroy our careers and our lives. Are you certain you want to proceed? The answer was unanimous and immediate. Davies spoke for all of them. We swore to protect the royal family. Sometimes that means protecting them from the crown itself. Morrison nodded, feeling the weight of leadership and the terrible excitement of absolute purpose. Then we proceed with Operation Golden Key. In 72 hours, we're going to give the Princess of Wales something she hasn't had in months, a choice about her own life. As they dispersed to their regular duties, each man carried with him the knowledge that they were about to attempt something unprecedented in the history of the British monarchy. They were about to prove that loyalty to the crown sometimes meant betraying the institution that wore it, and that the greatest act of service sometimes looked exactly like rebellion. The countdown to Catherine's escape had begun, and there would be no turning back. The day of the escape dawned grey and cold, with November rain pelting the windows of Buckingham Palace like an omen. Morrison had barely slept, running through every detail of their plan, checking and rechecking every possible failure point. In 18 hours, either Princess Catherine would taste freedom for the first time in months, or 4 decorated soldiers would face court-martial and imprisonment. The morning briefing proceeded normally, with Colonel Richardson reviewing routine security protocols while Morrison and his team listened with faces that revealed nothing of their inner turmoil. Richardson announced that the weekly senior staff security meeting would begin at 2:30 that afternoon, providing them with the exact timing they needed. Morrison caught Davies' eye briefly, a silent confirmation that the operation would proceed as planned. Catherine's day began like any other in her gilded prison. Williams served her breakfast tea with his usual quiet kindness, but this time the sugar packet contained more than sweetener. Dissolved in the sugar was a tiny paper message. Today at 3:45. Kitchen service corridor. Be ready. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she stirred her tea, dissolving both sugar and message into invisibility. Throughout the morning, each member of Morrison's team performed their regular duties while making final preparations. Davies confirmed that the service corridors were clear and established the timing for disabling key surveillance cameras without triggering automatic alerts. Thompson verified that the kitchen staff would be occupied with preparation for the evening state dinner, leaving their escape route unmonitored. Williams used his access to Catherine's schedule to ensure she would be in position at exactly the right moment. But at noon, their carefully laid plans nearly collapsed entirely. An unexpected visitor arrived at the palace, Prince William, returning early from his official tour of Scotland. Morrison watched from his position in the Grand Hall as the Prince of Wales strode through the corridors with barely contained fury, heading directly toward his wife's restricted quarters. This wasn't part of anyone's schedule, and Morrison realized that William's presence could either provide perfect cover for their operation or destroy it completely. Morrison made a split-second decision that would haunt him for years afterward. Instead of aborting the mission, he chose to trust that William's unexpected arrival might actually help their cause. If the Prince of Wales was fighting the same battle they were, perhaps they could find an unexpected ally in the royal family itself. At 2:30, Colonel Richardson's security meeting began as scheduled. drawing away the senior staff who posed the greatest threat to their operation. Morrison stationed himself outside the meeting room, ostensibly as security, but actually as an early warning system for his team. Through the partially open door, he could hear Richardson briefing his subordinates on new restrictions for Catherine, including plans to limit her contact with her children to supervised visits twice weekly. Morrison felt rage build in his chest as he listened to these men discuss Catherine's life as if she were a dangerous prisoner rather than a woman who had dedicated her life to public service. Richardson's voice carried satisfaction as he described how compliant the princess had become under their current protocols, how she had stopped requesting communication privileges and seemed to be accepting her security requirements. What Richardson didn't know was that Catherine's apparent compliance was actually careful strategy. Through their secret communication system, she had told Morrison's team that she was pretending to submit while planning her escape. Her seeming acceptance of restrictions had caused Richardson to become overconfident, reducing some of the monitoring that would have made their mission impossible. At 3:30, Morrison signaled Williams to begin the final phase. Williams approached Catherine in the blue drawing room, where she sat staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. "Your Royal Highness," he said softly, "your afternoon tea is ready in the small kitchen. The chef has prepared something special today." Catherine understood immediately. The small kitchen was adjacent to the service corridor they would use for her escape. She rose gracefully, her composure hiding the fear and excitement that threatened to overwhelm her. As she walked toward what might be freedom or disaster, Catherine realized that she was about to discover who she really was, when stripped of titles, protocol, and the suffocating protection of palace walls. Thompson had positioned himself at the critical junction between the main palace corridors and the service areas. His job was to ensure no one followed Catherine into their carefully planned escape route. As she passed his position, Thompson fell into step behind her, ostensibly as escort, but actually as protection against discovery. Davies waited in the service corridor with civilian clothes, a wig to disguise Catherine's distinctive hair, and identification papers that would get her past security checkpoints. The transformation took less than 3 minutes, from princess to ordinary woman, from royal target to anonymous civilian. Catherine looked at herself in the small mirror Davies provided and smiled for the first time in weeks. "I had forgotten what it felt like to look normal," she whispered. Morrison joined them at the predetermined rendezvous point, carrying a maintenance worker's uniform that would serve as his own disguise. The plan called for him to escort Catherine out of the palace while Davies and Thompson created diversions that would delay any pursuit. Williams would remain at his post, ready to provide misdirection if Catherine's absence was discovered before they cleared the palace grounds. The walk through the service corridors felt like the longest journey of Morrison's life. Every footstep seemed to echo with potential discovery. Every shadow might hide someone who would recognize the princess despite her disguise. Catherine walked beside him with remarkable calm, her transformation from broken prisoner to determined escapee complete. "I never thought I would be grateful to walk through a basement corridor," she told him quietly, "but this feels like the most beautiful place in the world right now." They reached the maintenance exit that would take them beyond the palace walls. Morrison had used his security access to disable the alarms temporarily, creating a window of exactly 12 minutes before the system would automatically reset. As he input his access code, Morrison realized that this moment would mark the end of his career in royal service. After today, there would be no going back to the life he had known for 8 years. The heavy door opened, revealing London's busy street beyond the palace walls. Catherine stepped through first, breathing deeply as cold rain touched her face. "I had forgotten what the outside world smelled like," she said, her voice filled with wonder at simple freedom. Morrison followed her through the door, then turned to secure it behind them. As the lock clicked into place, he felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They had done it. They had successfully removed the Princess of Wales from Buckingham Palace against direct orders from their superiors. The easy part was over. Now they had to keep her safe while she decided what to do with her freedom. The car they had arranged was waiting exactly where Thompson had promised, driven by Davies' brother-in-law who asked no questions and offered complete discretion. As they drove away from the palace, Catherine pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar landmarks of London pass by, like scenes from a half-remembered dream. "Where would you like to go, Your Royal Highness?" Morrison asked, still uncertain how to address her now that she was no longer under palace protection. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities she hadn't been allowed to contemplate in months. "I want to see my children," she said finally. "Not a supervised visit, not a scheduled appearance. I want to hold them and remember who I am when I'm just their mother." Morrison nodded. understanding that Catherine's escape wasn't just about physical freedom. It was about reclaiming her identity as a person rather than just a royal symbol. He gave the driver directions to the private school where the royal children were students, knowing that this decision would create an international incident that would change everything. As they drove through London traffic, Morrison's radio crackled with increasingly frantic communications from the palace. Catherine's absence had been discovered, and Colonel Richardson was demanding answers from his entire security team. Morrison turned off his radio and threw it out the car window. There would be time for consequences later. Right now, his only concern was protecting the woman who had trusted him with her freedom. Catherine sat beside him, no longer the broken prisoner he had watched deteriorate over months of psychological torture. She was transforming back into the person she had been before the palace walls became her cage, confident, determined, and ready to fight for her right to exist as more than just a royal symbol. "What happens now?" Morrison asked, genuinely uncertain about the path they had chosen. Catherine smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached her eyes. "Now we find out if it's possible to be both a princess and a person," she said. "And we discover whether the British people will support a royal who chooses truth over tradition." The car continued through London's streets, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but away from certain destruction. Behind them, Buckingham Palace erupted into controlled chaos as the full scope of their rebellion became clear. Ahead lay challenges and consequences that none of them could fully anticipate. But for the first time in months, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was free to choose her own path. And that, Morrison realized, made every risk they had taken worthwhile. The reunion between Catherine and her children took place in the headmaster's private office at Lambrook School, away from prying eyes and palace surveillance. When Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis saw their mother walk through the door without the usual entourage of security and protocol officers, their reactions told Morrison everything he needed to know about how deeply the palace restrictions had affected this family. "Mummy!" Charlotte cried, running into Catherine's arms without the careful restraint that had marked their recent supervised visits. "You look different. You look like you used to." Catherine held her children close, tears streaming down her face as she realized how much of herself she had lost during months of imprisonment. "I feel like myself again," she whispered. And Morrison saw the exact moment when the broken woman he had protected transformed back into the fierce mother who would fight the world to protect her family. The headmaster, Dr. Jonathan Parry, had been quietly supportive when Morrison contacted him earlier that day. "The children have been asking why their visits with their mother became so formal and restricted," he had told Morrison. "Whatever is happening at the palace, it's affecting these children badly. They deserve time with their mother, without handlers and observers." As Catherine reconnected with her children, Morrison received increasingly urgent calls on the encrypted phone Davies had provided. Williams was still at the palace, reporting that Colonel Richardson had ordered a complete lockdown of the facility and was demanding explanations from every member of the security team.
They know she didn't leave on her own, Williams reported.
"Richardson is conducting interrogations, starting with anyone who had contact with the princess today." Davies and Thompson had successfully evaded immediate suspicion by maintaining their regular duties, but Morrison knew their window of safety was closing rapidly. Soon Richardson would realize that the escape required inside knowledge and assistance, and he would begin systematically investigating every guard who had access to Catherine's quarters and schedule. But Morrison's immediate concern wasn't his own safety. It was what would happen when palace officials inevitably tracked Catherine to the school. He knew they had perhaps 2 hours before the full weight of royal security descended on their location, and Catherine needed to make some critical decisions about her future during that time. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said quietly, approaching Catherine as she helped Louis with his artwork. "We need to discuss what happens next. The palace will find us soon, and you need to decide how you want to handle the confrontation." Catherine looked up from her son's drawing, her expression shifting from loving mother to strategic thinker. "I've been preparing for this conversation for weeks," she said. "I know exactly what I want to say, and I know exactly what I want to change." What Catherine revealed next surprised even Morrison, who had come to respect her intelligence and determination during their secret communications. During her months of isolation, she hadn't simply endured psychological torture, she had been documenting it. Using her artistic skills, she had created detailed drawings of every surveillance camera installed in her quarters, every restricted activity, every cancelled engagement. She had memorized dates, times, and the names of everyone involved in her confinement. "I may have been treated like a prisoner," Catherine said, "but I was watching and recording everything they did to me. I have evidence of systematic psychological abuse disguised as security measures, and I have documentation of how they manipulated my schedule and communications to isolate me from everyone I cared about. Morrison realized that Catherine's escape wasn't just about freedom, it was about justice. She had been building a case against her captors while pretending to submit to their authority, and now she was ready to present that evidence to the world. The first sign of pursuit came at 4:30, when Davies called to report that palace vehicles were leaving Buckingham Palace with emergency lights activated. "They're mobilizing everything," Davies said. "Richardson has called in additional security from Windsor Castle and Sandringham. They're treating this like a kidnapping rather than an escape." Catherine's response was immediate and decisive. "Then we meet them head-on," she said. "I'm tired of hiding, and I'm tired of letting other people control the narrative about my life." Morrison watched with amazement as Catherine transformed from protected princess to commanding presence. She called the headmaster and requested use of his conference room for an emergency meeting. She contacted her personal solicitor, the first outside communication she had been allowed in months, and arranged for legal representation. Most dramatically, she called her closest friend, journalist Sarah Williams, and asked her to come to the school immediately. "If they're going to treat this like a public crisis," Catherine explained to Morrison, "then I'm going to make sure the public hears my side of the story first." By 5 o'clock, the school had become the center of an unprecedented royal drama. Palace vehicles surrounded the building while inside. Catherine prepared to face her captors with evidence of their abuse and a determination to reclaim control of her own life. The children, sensing the importance of the moment, stayed close to their mother but remained remarkably calm, as if they understood that this confrontation would determine their family's future. Cornwall Richardson arrived with a team of security personnel and palace officials, his face rigid with fury and embarrassment. Morrison watched through the conference room window as Richardson deployed his men around the building, clearly intending to retake custody of Catherine, regardless of her wishes. But Richardson had underestimated both Catherine's preparation and her support. When he entered the conference room with his official demands for Catherine's immediate return to palace custody, he found himself facing not just a rebellious princess, but a documented case of institutional abuse, and a room full of witnesses, including legal representation and media presence. "Colonel Richardson," Catherine said, her voice carrying an authority Morrison had never heard before, "I want you to explain to these witnesses why you believed it was necessary to install surveillance equipment in my private quarters without my consent. I want you to justify why my communications with friends and family were blocked entirely rather than simply monitored, and I want you to tell everyone in this room why my children's access to their mother was restricted to twice-weekly supervised visits." Richardson's response was predictable but damning. He claimed security protocols, terrorist threats, and operational necessity. But when Catherine's solicitor pressed him for specific threat assessments and official authorizations, Richardson couldn't provide documentation for many of the restrictions that had been imposed on the princess. The turning point came when Catherine presented her evidence, detailed drawings, precise timelines, and documented examples of how her isolation had been deliberately increased over time. "This isn't protection," she told the assembled group. "This is systematic psychological abuse designed to break my spirit and force my compliance with decisions I was never consulted about." Morrison watched Richardson's face as he realized that his victim had not only escaped, but had gathered evidence of his abuse. The colonel's authority, which had seemed absolute within palace walls, crumbled in the face of Catherine's documented truth and public exposure. But the most powerful moment came when Prince George, only 10 years old, spoke directly to Richardson. "Why did you make it so our mummy couldn't hug us properly anymore? Why did you make her so sad that she cried every day?" The innocence and directness of the child's question cut through all the official justifications and security protocols. Richardson, facing a room full of people who could now see his actions through a child's eyes, had no answer that didn't sound like exactly what it was: institutional bullying of a woman whose only crime was independent thinking. At 6:15, Prince William arrived at the school, having driven himself without security escort. His entrance changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Morrison watched as William embraced his wife and children, then turned to face Richardson with an expression of cold fury. "Colonel," William said, his voice carrying unmistakable royal command, "you will explain to me immediately why my wife has been treated like a prisoner in her own home, and you will explain why I was not consulted about restrictions that affected my family's daily life." Richardson's stammered explanations about security protocols and operational requirements sounded increasingly hollow when faced with William's direct questions. It became clear that many of the restrictions on Catherine had been implemented without William's knowledge during his official travels, taking advantage of his absence to isolate Catherine completely. The confrontation ended not with dramatic threats or official sanctions, but with simple truth. Catherine had documented systematic abuse, gathered witnesses, and presented evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Richardson's authority collapsed under the weight of exposure, and the elaborate justifications for Catherine's imprisonment revealed themselves as nothing more than institutional cruelty disguised as protection. Morrison and his 3 colleagues were called to account for their actions, but in the context of Catherine's evidence, their rebellion appeared not as betrayal, but as the only moral response to an immoral situation. Davies, Williams, and Thompson were formally reprimanded but not dismissed, their actions viewed as upholding their oath to protect the royal family, even when that protection required defying their superiors. Morrison accepted voluntary resignation from royal service, but with a full pension and official recognition that his actions had prevented serious harm to a member of the royal family. Sometimes, he told the inquiry panel, protecting someone means protecting them from the very institution meant to keep them safe. In the months that followed, Catherine's escape became a catalyst for major reforms in palace security protocols, with new oversight mechanisms to prevent the abuse of protective measures. Richardson was quietly transferred to other duties, his career in royal protection effectively ended by his own overreach. But the most important outcome wasn't institutional change, it was personal freedom. Catherine reclaimed control of her communications, her schedule, and her relationship with her children. The surveillance equipment was removed from her quarters, the restrictions on her movements were lifted, and she was once again free to be both a princess and a person. Morrison never spoke publicly about the details of the escape, honoring both his commitment to discretion and Catherine's privacy, but he remained in contact with the princess, receiving occasional updates about her family and her return to public service on her own terms. 2 years later, Morrison received a handwritten note from Catherine on the anniversary of her escape. "Thank you for reminding me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. You and your colleagues didn't just help me escape from prison. You helped me remember who I am when I'm free to be myself." Morrison kept that note in his wallet, a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of service requires the courage to say no to authority and yes to conscience. The Royal Guard had always sworn to protect the crown, but that day, 4 men learned that sometimes protecting the crown means protecting the people who wear it from the institution that created it. The escape had lasted only hours, but its effects would resonate for years, proving that even within the most tradition-bound institution in Britain, human dignity and personal freedom could triumph over protocol and power when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things for the right reasons.